Hello world, welcome back to the Razor RC. Super excited to bring to you another tuning video, this time on the Traxxas E-Revo 2.0. I've been driving this truck for the last couple of weeks, doing a lot of testing, a lot of tuning, a lot of improvements, kind of figuring out a few things about this truck that I think improve the performance of this quite a bit. So I wanted to cover the changes I made to my completely stock Traxxas E-Revo and kind of explain why I made those changes and what effect you'll see. So this is basically like a dirt bashing type setup. Even off-road track I think it would work pretty well. The E-Revo 2.0 out of the box drives okay. It's not bad. Definitely has some specific characteristics to the way it drives. As you can see, the E-Revo is obviously got the lay-down shocks, very low center of gravity type vehicle design with the batteries here on the sides, kind of like below the electronics. Flipping it over, you can see some interesting things. So one of the most interesting things about the E-Revo is it's got kind of like this long arm, narrow pivot type design. So if you look at the hinge pins, they're basically right in the middle, probably 2 millimeters apart. And then it's got super long arms that extend from that middle center line all the way out to the ends where the wheels get attached. So this long arm type suspension design pretty much induces a little more roll. It's going to pivot over those center hinge pins a little more easily. The chassis is going to roll a little bit more. There's a little more leverage on the wheels and tires from the shock. So kind of unique and kind of what you'll find driving this vehicle is that it has a lot of steering up front. The front of the vehicle actually bites in pretty easily, bites in pretty hard. Roll is something that maybe is not completely well understood, but roll actually generates traction, it actually generates grip. When you turn the wheels, when you go in a corner, you kind of bite down. The vehicle will actually roll on the front end quite a bit. This vehicle has fairly soft springs out of the box, so bites in hard. Which actually is a nice thing. It rolls a bit in the front and allows those tires to kind of dig in. So this vehicle out of the box, you'll find, has a lot of steering on the front end. Definitely has a lot of traction, a lot of grip, bites in really hard. But where I think it gets hurt a little more is on the rear end. Rear end of the vehicle, kind of the same thing, long arm design, fairly soft suspension, but the problem is when you're steering, when you're going around a corner, the rear end also rolls quite a bit, and it's fairly linear, meaning it rolls fairly quickly and kind of extensively, so it's kind of over rolling in the rear. What you'll find is that, okay, it seems to grip, you're going around a corner, but then at some point, somewhere around the middle, it just kind of over rolls, loses all traction, and kind of spins out a bit. So the rear end will generate grip in the initial part of the corner, in the initial part of the roll, but as it keeps going around the corner, you'll find that it over rolls and basically you end up losing traction. So controlling that roll is kind of the name of the game here, and I'm going to talk about changes I made. So on the front end, let's just kind of talk about toe in, which is basically how your wheels are pointed. Out of the box, it's got a little bit of toe out, probably 1 degree or so. I would recommend just going back to 0 degrees. That will aid your straight line stability quite a bit. A little bit of toe out allows you to kind of initiate corners, initiate turns a lot. But this vehicle, like I already mentioned, has tons of steering. You don't really need that. Putting it in line, just straight ahead wheels will allow it to be a little more stable at full speed. I mean, it goes pretty fast, over 50 miles per hour. So a little bit of straight line stability is nice, and you don't need that extra turning initiation. It also has 0 degrees of camber out of the box. I think that's also fine. You could go half a degree or 1 degree in. Camber is basically the tires being straight up and down or angled in a little bit. I think totally straight up and down is fine, or half a degree, 1 degree in is totally fine as well. No, not too many concerns there. Spring wise, I am running the springs from the rear end. So these are the tan springs that normally come on the back of the vehicle. I took them off the rear end, stuck them in the front. One kind of funky thing about this design is the shocks, as you can see, are super short. Hardly any travel at all, probably about 3/4 of an inch at most of travel. Obviously it has the push rod type suspension, and what you'll find is these rockers actually are kind of a ratio reducer. So probably for like every inch of travel on the arms results in only maybe like a quarter to half inch of travel on the shocks. So it kind of is reducing all that movement down to just like a tiny bit of movement by the time you actually get to the shocks. So that's why the shocks are so short. Every little quarter inch of movement actually has to accommodate a lot of arm travel all the way at the rear ends, or all the way at the ends of the arms. So overall, you'll find the springs are fairly stiff as compared to other E-scale truggies. They're short, they're stiff, but then really they're doing a lot of work for just, you know, a little bit of travel. That's why they're kind of set that way out of the box. Front end is actually not too bad spring wise. I left the shock oils the same, still running 40 weight, which is what it comes with out of the box. Running the tan springs, I think, kind of stabilizes the front end a little bit. Doesn't dip quite as much. Another thing you'll notice on the stock vehicles, on brakes, the front end kind of dives in, bites hard, but then the rear end will kind of swing around a little bit unstable on the brakes, and kind of turns in a little too hard. Running some stiffer springs will help that. So yeah, that's kind of my suggestions for the front end. Now in the middle, does have a center differential, really nice, a lot of tunability. 20 million weight in the middle out of the box. That is way too thick. 20 million weight oil is probably reasonable for like a 5th scale, 6th scale type vehicle, but on this it's pretty much functions as a lock differential. Now why is a lock differential bad? The problem is, what the differential normally allows you to do is it allows the front and rear end wheels to turn at slightly different speeds. When you're going over rough terrain, when you're driving off-road, every wheel and tire is not going to spin at exactly the same speed. You got bumps, you've got variable levels of traction. Maybe some tires are gripping harder than others. Others have a little less traction. Maybe they're slightly in the air. Maybe they're on some rocks or, you know, dirt or grass or whatever. So having a little bit of fluidity in that center differential actually allows all 4 wheels to kind of rotate at the appropriate speed to gain a little more traction, a little more handling, a little more steering as well. Makes the overall car a little more fluid. Once you lock down that center differential, basically all 4 wheels are kind of like locked together, and they're never going to want to rotate at exactly the same speed. So you're actually losing traction by throwing in super crazy thick oil like the 20 million. I would recommend going between 200 and 300K oil in the center differential. I'm running about 200K right now. Might be a hair light. You know, might want to run more like 250, 300. But somewhere in that range will allow this thing to basically actually generate more traction in the dirt, actually give you a little more steering. The wheels are not going to be sliding around so much. Like, problem with kind of a lock differential and everything all locked together, yeah, it's great if all of them are spinning and able to gain traction, but if some of them are not, actually all 4 will tend to spin kind of together, so you actually end up losing traction. So going lighter on the center differential definitely will make things a lot better. Moving on to the rear end, and here's kind of the secret weapon of the E-Revo. A lot of people don't realize this, but they actually make different rocker arms here on the rear end. They make 3 different levels, basically a progressive 1, 2, and 3. Out of the box, it comes with progressive 2 rockers. I don't think anyone on YouTube has ever put out a video on this, but it is really important to kind of pay attention to those things. And out of the box, like I mentioned, a lot of roll on the rear end. The rear end is super soft, especially with the stock springs. What happens is as the car kind of rolls onto one side, the arms, you know, sort of start compressing, but they don't really stop. They just keep compressing, and then eventually you overload that outside tire. It spins out, and that's why you kind of get that rear end feeling super loose, not having a whole ton of traction. Tires out of the box are not completely great. Certainly can be worth looking at different tires, but really the fundamental problem with the rear end is these rocker arms. I highly recommend you pick these up. Traxxas 5359, and I'll put a link in the description below, but these are the progressive 3 arms. They basically allow the shocks to load up and get stiffer and stiffer as you compress the suspension. That way when the rear end is kind of rolling through the corner, it loads up, but it does not completely, you know, overwhelm the tires and spin out quite as easily. Other thing I recommend doing is picking up the black springs from the rear end. Again, those springs have one less coil than the stock springs, so the fewer the coils you have on a spring, actually the more progressive it is. That'll again help you with that progression, allow it to load up the tires a little more in a progressive manner, not overwhelm them quite as much. I'm also running 47.5 weight oil here in the rear. The rear end is definitely on the soft side. Running the stiffer springs, the progressive rockers will also help you land bigger jumps a little better because they're not just going to blow through the shock travel quite as fast. They'll still chassis slap on big jumps. You know, this is kind of set for maybe 10-foot high jumps at most, 15 feet high, that kind of thing. But it will allow it to land a little bit better, being a little more balanced with the front end. The shock on the rear are definitely way too soft and light as compared to the front end. So be more in balance front to rear. Not going to be like, you know, nose diving and wheeling quite as crazy. So when you have them more in balance. So that is important. The other thing you'll have to do is adjust these steering links, or I'm sorry, these, what are these called? These rods, I guess, tie rods or push rods. You do need to lengthen these ball cups a little bit. I think it's 54 millimeters from ball cup to ball cup, so just measure that from there to there. It's about 1 millimeter, I think, more from stock. Just loosen both ends by, like, you know, a half turn or a turn or so, like that. That's just to maintain the same amount of droop as before, because with the different rocker arms, they're a little more progressive. They're a little bit shorter actually, so you actually have to lengthen this a little bit just to get the same amount of suspension travel as before. So yeah, I think that's pretty much it on the rear end. Also, I went to 3 degrees of rear toe in. So rear toe mine was a little out of whack out of the box. You want about 3 degrees in. You know, just kind of eyeball it. You don't actually have to measure it. You know, make it look something like that. Just make sure they're even. And then again, negative 1 degree of camber. So tilt the tires in just a little bit. They shouldn't be straight up and down when it's on the ground with batteries. Should tilt in just a little bit. Just make sure it's even. And I think you'll find that that works a lot better for you. So yeah, those are my tips. Basically the razor tune for the Traxxas E-Revo 2.0. When you're driving on dirt, even racing it, I would say, bashing it, sending it, you know, 8-10 feet high in the air, I think this will work out really well for you. Even on the street, it should be pretty good. The out-of-the-box setup, again, is way too soft for the street. I think this will allow it to drive with the handle a little bit better, be easier to control, and I find that, you know, it just is more enjoyable overall to drive. So anyways, that's it for the razor tune for the E-Revo 2.0. I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to hit the like, share, and subscribe buttons. Look for more videos soon. Thanks for watching.